the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasures of the earth, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio, or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time, or die by suicide. Abraham Lincoln, 1838.
Before Bull Run, no Americans really understood what the war would mean. They couldn't, because there was nothing in the American experience that could possibly have prepared them for what they were going to have to endure.
Both sides were living in a dream world. This was a moonlight and romance kind of attitude that both sides had, which explains this joyful spirit of enlisting, men dashing to the recruiting offices, absolutely petrified the war might end before they could get in and seek their red badge of courage, as a battle wound was called in those days.
Neither expected the other to be able to fight, so both went forward filled with confidence that not only would they have a victory, but that they would have an easy victory. It would be a short war, a summer's war, and by fall they would all be home.
By the summer of 1861, North and South were so far apart they could not even agree on a name for the war's first great clash.
Each side named battles differently. The North would name its battle after the closest stream. The South will name its battle after the closest town. So this first explosion in the North will be called the Battle of Bull Run. In the South, it will be known as the Battle of Manassas.
Not only the attention of the country, but the attention of the world was focused on the Manassas-Washington front. None of the things that Americans had been involved in resembled in scope or intensity what was about to begin on the plains of Manassas in July '61.
Long divided by economic and cultural differences, America had finally reached the breaking point. With Lincoln's election as president in 1860, the so-called United States consisted of 34 states. By the time of his inauguration in March 1861, 7 deep southern states had formed a new nation.
The Southerners viewed themselves as really fighting a second American Revolution. They were seeking liberty, and they were seeking independence, which the American colonies had done in 1776. When they were called rebels and Southern soldiers were nicknamed Johnny Rebs, they took no offense at this whatsoever because their grandparents had been called the American rebels by the British government.
Within weeks of Lincoln taking office, Southern forces captured a federal garrison at Fort Sumter outside Charleston, South Carolina.
When finally the firing on Fort Sumter takes place on April 12th of '61, it's like a lightning bolt to a powder keg. It's what finally releases all the pent-up emotions of decades.
The military excitement in Washington is intense. Civil war is actually upon us, and strange to say, it brings a feeling of relief. The suspense is over. Congressman John Sherman, April 1861.
Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to crush the rebellion. Outraged, the Upper South joined the Confederacy.
Lincoln, in their eyes, was not raising an army to further defend the flag, which was his constitutional obligation. This was an army they saw raised to invade the South. And there's no way Lincoln's going to invade the Confederacy without marching across border states like Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee.
If we are conquered, we will be driven penniless and dishonored from the land of our birth. I had rather fall in this cause than to see my country dismantled of its glory and independence. William A. Smith, 14th North Carolina, 1861.
He's fighting in defense of his hearth and his home. The Union Army to him is an invader. It is coming down to overrun his land, to take away what he has been able to scrape together through a lifetime.
Southerners saw themselves as fighting in self-defense, but could not imagine what motivated their enemy.
Southerners could not envision why Northern boys would die for something as vague and flimsy as the Union. What they did not know, of course, was that 1 out of every 5 Billy Yanks was an immigrant. that men had traveled halfway around the world on behalf of this little flimsy dream known as the Union.
It's difficult for us to understand now in the late 20th century what Union meant to Northerners in the mid-19th century. The United States represented a democratic beacon to the rest of the world, and if we let this beacon be snuffed out by dismemberment of the Union, the world may lose something that it can never regain. There may not be another spark that will lead to another democratic society, such as the United States. It's something worth fighting for and something worth dying for.
First Manassas was a portent, most of all. It was an omen of what was to come and what would be the bloodiest event in all of American history. And it all begins one hot Sunday at a railroad junction called Manassas Junction.
Standing before a long mirror, I put in many hours of weary work and soon thought myself quite a soldier. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
Every young fellow who went to war got a kiss from his best girl. And as it was the first that many of us had ever enjoyed, it is not surprising that a last farewell was repeated over and over again before we actually took our departure. J.P. Cannon, 27th Alabama.
The entire society was at war. There was almost no opportunity not to go off to war. The drums were beating and the bands were playing, and the girls were at the county courthouse, while almost every able-bodied male of the appropriate age headed in and signed up and went off with all of his friends and his neighbors and his brothers and his cousins and his other relatives. Your community was going to war, and you went with them.
Many soldiers would recall their hometown farewells as one of the most stirring moments of their lives.
At last the regiment was formed in companies, and we marched. Was there ever such an ovation? Handkerchiefs fluttered in the air like myriads of white butterflies. An avenue of brave, honest faces smiled upon us as we passed and sent a sunshine into our hearts that lives there still. It's James O'Brien, 79, New York.
There were regiments who marched to war clad as French zouaves or even wearing a kilt and tartan and Glengarry cap in emulation of Highland regiments. Nobody knew at that point that one side would wear gray and one side would wear blue. So you had this colorful hodgepodge of uniforms, a bewildering variety of weaponry.
Hurrah, we are in Washington, and what a city. Mud, pigs, geese, Negroes, palaces, shanties everywhere. I was not well pleased with the appearance of the city, but was struck by the magnitude of the public buildings. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
These militia units were all gathering in the national capital to defend the Union with all these lofty ideals and principles, and the capital was just loaded with soldiers in all kinds of uniforms from all parts of the country, and this was all new and gay. And that autumn, a lady from New England named Julia Ward Howe would come to Washington, and she would be struck by what she called the watchfires of 100 circling camps, which became a line in her immortal song, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So Washington was alive with excitement. Not reality, but excitement.
I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on.
Along with the seriousness of purpose came the unleashing of high spirits. One famed regiment, the New York Fire Zouaves, was comprised entirely of firemen and dressed in colorful uniforms in imitation of French Algerian soldiers.
They were one of the most reckless, undisciplined, rowdy, hard-to-control bunch of scoundrels that ever was encamped in Washington. They cavorted across the unfinished dome of the Capitol. They escaped from their camp, ran the sentries in order to get a hold of fire engines and help battle fires that broke out in Washington.
The Zouaves were organized and commanded by Colonel Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth, a debonair young militia officer and a close friend of the Lincoln family. On May 24, 1861, Ellsworth became the first great martyr to the Union cause, shot dead while attempting to remove a giant Confederate flag from atop a Virginia inn.
Remember Ellsworth became a Union battle cry. To the North, this was an outrageous murder of a great national celebrity, a dashing young hero.
Lincoln himself goes into tremendous mourning because he was extremely fond of young Ellsworth. It was almost a father-son relationship between the two. So this is the first, but certainly not the last time, that Lincoln very personally feels the pain of loss in the war.
An outraged public demanded that Union forces crush the rebels. Under increasing pressure to act, Union Commander Irvin McDowell struggled to transform his raw recruits into an army.
If anyone wanted to look for a perfect example of how no one was trained or equipped to take command of an army of the kind being raised at the beginning of the Civil War, Irvin McDowell's got to be it. He had never led troops in battle at all. He'd spent most of his Army career on staff work in Washington. He had no training for commanding even a company, much less an army of 35,000 men.
No curse could be greater than invasion by a volunteer army. McDowell and all the generals tried their best, but to say we commanded that army is no such thing. They did as they pleased. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman.
We have these huge aggregations of civilians who have come into the military, and they're trying to grope their way toward becoming soldiers. Irvin McDowell knew that they weren't ready to go into battle, but there was tremendous political pressure for a battle. The Lincoln administration was under pressure to make something happen. We've got all these men in uniform. Let's go smite the rebels. Let's chastise them. Let's crush the rebellion and restore the Union. Let's move now. There's a drumbeat in the newspapers. Move now. Move against Richmond. Move against the rebels.
So Mr. Lincoln was quite anxious to go down and fight this one battle that would end the war. And so he ordered poor McDowell to take this mob of men and go march out and end the Civil War.
On July 16, 1861, McDowell marched his 35,000 men toward Manassas Junction. Years later, poet and novelist Herman Melville would describe the volunteers as they set off into the unknown.
All they feel is this: 'tis glory, a rapture sharp, though transitory, yet lasting and laureled story. So they gaily go to fight, chatting left and laughing right. But some who this blithe mood present, as in lightsome files they fare, shall die ere 3 days are spent, perish, enlightened by the volleyed glare.
Hostilities of a generation would finally clash at tiny Manassas Junction. The rebel armies were led by Generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter.
Virginia is cut in half by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The eastern half is protected at the beginning by Beauregard and his army. The western portion, the Shenandoah Valley, is held by Joseph E. Johnston. By using that rail line between these two halves, either force could shift back and forth to support the other. Thus, the two armies really could almost double their strength.
69-year-old Union General Robert Patterson commanded a small force facing Johnston in the Shenandoah Valley. Meanwhile, the Federal Army under McDowell moved from Washington to confront Beauregard at Manassas.
McDowell moved very slowly toward Manassas, moving 30,000, 35,000 men over a road, only marching 6, 8, 10 abreast at best. Could mean that your column could be stretched out for 10 miles. And all it took was one slow regiment someplace to deadlock everybody behind them. On top of which, McDowell was simply slow himself. He was terrified. He did not want to be making this campaign because he knew he and his army weren't ready.
The young soldiers soon discovered that this was no holiday excursion.
They expected to make a quick march and have a quick victory, and that march would just prove to be a nightmare for them. They're bumping into each other. They're having to double time a mile here and stand in position an hour there. The food is running out. The heat is awful. The humidity is awful. It was just a horrible ordeal for these men.
As the Union Army crept forward, Beauregard stood on the banks of Bull Run, anxiously awaiting reinforcements.
It's difficult to overemphasize just how hair's breadth a thing this Battle of Manassas was for the Confederates. As of the morning of July 18th, Beauregard is on his own along Bull Run with an army of only about 18 to 20,000 men, and he knows that McDowell's Yankee army is in front of him with a strength perhaps of 35 to 37,000 men.
Unknown to Beauregard, Johnston had already decoyed Patterson into holding his position.
And while Patterson wrote messages to Washington assuring Washington that Johnston's army was still in the Shenandoah Valley, Johnston was in fact marching over the mountains and about to board the trains to join Beauregard on the plains of Manassas.
All during the day before the main battle, most of the Federals can hear the steam whistles on locomotives coming into Manassas Junction and going out. And a number of McDowell's officers suspect that what's happening is that Beauregard is receiving substantial reinforcements, but they don't know for sure.
Despite misgivings, McDowell issued the final battle orders. As night fell, on July 20th, soldiers on both sides knew that the dawn would forever change their lives.
All is hushed and still. As I look up at the starry vault and think of the morrow, I must confess, I am a bit homesick. Caleb Clark, 2nd Ohio.
At 2 o'clock, one drum sounded through the camp and was repeated through the numerous camps around us. And in half an hour, 40,000 men stood ready to battle for the Union. Union Private Edwin S. Barrett.
One of McDowell's mistakes was starting his movement on Sunday, the 21st, so early in the morning. He started at 2:30 a.m., long before the sun came up. Night marches were difficult for veteran troops, never mind men who had never marched more than 5 miles in their lives.
Many of the Union troops, when they reached that battlefield at Bull Run, were in a condition of almost utter exhaustion. They had been marching for several days through the heat and dust. They had had to cut their way through the brush. They had had to march towards the battle. They were covered with sweat. Their legs were chafed. The wool uniforms were sticking to their clammy flesh.
Minutes before encountering the enemy, Union soldiers were greeted by the sight of Washington high society.
Literally hundreds of civilians rode out with their buggies that Sunday. They came out with their picnic baskets and in their carriages, and they spread their blankets on the bare hillsides, and there they sat like participants in a great grandstand watching this battle unfold.
Those people in their frilly carriages, carrying their picnic lunches, faithfully reflect what this nation expected this war to be like. They thought it was going to be a picnic.
At 10 a.m., the Union Army drew first blood. 10,000 Federal soldiers attacked at Matthews Hill, overwhelming 1,000 Confederates.
The air was filled with a medley of sounds: shouts, cheers, commands, oaths, the sharp retort of rifles, groans, and prayers. Arnold Williams, 2nd Rhode Island.
Men in any one company probably were serving alongside boys they'd gone all through school with, in many cases with their own brothers.
What they were most unprepared for was the horror of seeing their friends struck down around them and writhing in agony on the ground. Nothing glorious about that. Usually not a very quick death.
My first thought was, this is unfair. Somebody is to blame for getting us all killed. I didn't come out here to fight this way. I wish the earth would crack open and let me drop in. Daniel Ashby, 8th Georgia.
The technology had outpaced the tactics, and that meant that men would go marching up to their deaths in tight formation, elbow to elbow, just as Napoleon's men had done, when the weapons had progressed to an extent that those formations could be torn to pieces at a much greater range. The war would be fought by these geometrical blocks of flesh and blood, maneuvering to deliver their fire on an opponent.
After suffering through an hour of deadly firepower, the Confederates began to fall back.
The Federals, for the moment, think they're victorious. In fact, Irvin McDowell arrives on the battlefield, his staff waving their hats, yelling, "Victory, victory, victory!"
Outnumbered 10-1, the rebels struggled to slow the Union advance.
The Confederates on Matthews Hill had fought for time. They had bought about 90 minutes dearly with hundreds of lives. But Irvin McDowell followed those 90 minutes by awarding the Confederates 2 hours of time cost-free, simply because he stopped. And it was that delay, more than any other, that would turn the tide of this battle.
In those critical hours between noon and 2 p.m., thousands of Joseph E. Johnson's men would arrive by railroad and join ranks under the command of a little-known general named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. As the battle entered a critical phase, what had been fierce fighting turned ferocious. Battered but unbowed, the Confederates under General Bernard B. retreated from Matthews Hill to nearby Henry Hill.
As B was falling back toward Henry House Hill, he galloped up onto the hill to see what troops, if any, were there to give him an anchor. And there he encountered his old West Point comrade, Thomas J. Jackson. And B said something to the effect, "General, they're pushing us back," to which Jackson very calmly then said, "Well, sir, we shall give them the bayonet."
Jackson's personal style was a clenched-jawed determination, a stern power of will to succeed. And on a field peopled by military innocents on both sides of the line, Jackson's determination, his intentness on winning, his confidence that he was doing God's will, these things combined to make him a rock.
With that reinforcement from Jackson, B rode back down the hill, and in the bottom, as his disorganized men were falling back, B looked up atop Henry House Hill, pointed and shouted above the din of battle, "Look, men, there stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally behind the Virginians."
In that moment, the legend of Stonewall Jackson was born. Confederate troops did rally around Jackson and his brigade, fortifying Henry Hill. Undaunted, Union soldiers charged up the hill.
If they could secure that hill, they could turn the entire Confederate army. And from their vantage point down in the valley, looking up to the hill, it looked empty. And so, of course, they charge up this hill with great enthusiasm. And about 30 yards from the top of this hill, suddenly from behind the brow of the hill, up rises this Confederate brigade from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, which just delivered a point-blank volley of musketry right into their faces.
A recently invented form of ammunition, the mini-ball made musket fire from both sides far deadlier than in earlier wars.
The bullet itself would often careen around inside the body, shattering bones, tearing vital organs and arteries. It's one reason why you have so many amputations in the Civil War. The caliber of those bullets, 58 caliber, was so great that the damage incurred couldn't be rectified even today with anything other than amputation. There just wasn't anything left of the bone.
There were at least 40 men, some with both legs shot off, others with horrid flesh wounds. They lay so thick around me that I could hardly step between them, and every step was in blood. Some besought me to kill them and put an end to their agony. Union Private Edwin S. Barrett.
With Jackson's forces gaining strength, McDowell brought out the Union cannons.
They rolled 2 artillery batteries up to within about 300 yards of Jackson's line. Jackson's men hunker down below the slope of the hill. Union shells whistle over their heads. What McDowell apparently wanted to do was to roll his cannon up and blast a hole in the Confederate line. That's what Napoleon had done. But Napoleon didn't have rifles to contend with.
Confederate guns from atop the hill decimated the artillerymen.
There was never such a destructive fire. It looked as if every horse and man of that battery just laid down and died right off. Union Lieutenant William Averill.
A regiment of New York fire zouaves, the same men who had caroused in Washington, were rushed in to support the artillery.
These men who hadn't quite figured out yet how you deploy exactly from column into line were sort of stumbling about the field, their officers shouting and cursing, trying to get them in some sort of formation.
Into the confusion rode Colonel James Ewell Brown Stewart and his Virginia cavalry.
And as Jeb Stuart and his horsemen plowed into the fire zouaves, those zealous New York firemen felt their patriotism draining out of them, and many of them then and there took to their heels.
With thick smoke from muskets and cannons shrouding the field, the fight was fast disintegrating into a battle between 2 armed mobs. The wide variety of uniforms added to the chaos.
There was a symphony of color on the plains of Manassas that, once the shooting started, often became very deadly, because one of the hallmarks of the First Battle of Manassas is that these men simply had a hard time figuring out who was who on the battlefield.
At Bull Run, both armies had some troops in blue. With the fighting at its most intense, Union Artillery Captain Charles Griffin spotted a line of blue uniforms bearing down on his position.
Charles Griffin saw a Confederate line of battle coming toward him, and he turned his 2 guns on those Confederates. But as he did so, his commanding officer came up to him and said, "Don't fire there. Those men are Union men." And Griffin said to him, Griffin was a pretty cantankerous fellow, he said, "I swear for the world those men are Confederates." And the commanding officer said, "No, those are your battery support. I just sent them there." They leveled their guns at Griffin's battery, and they fired a volley. And Griffin said later, "That was the end of us."
The men in blue were in fact the Virginia 33rd Infantry. Their assault captured the Union batteries, turning the tide of battle. His forces in disarray, Irvin McDowell committed one final blunder that sealed defeat.
Instead of sending in his attacks by full brigades or by even a division, he sends in a regiment at a time. And what happens is when one regiment attacks against 3 or 4 regiments of the enemy, that regiment gets cut up. McDowell then sends in another regiment. The same thing happens to them, and it's very easy to use up a major portion of your army, achieving nothing.
As Union soldiers died by the hundreds, Confederate reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley poured in to support Beauregard and Jackson.
Every minute that passed during the fighting on Henry Hill meant more Confederate troops would be arriving on the field. And by 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Yankees had no regiments left to put into the fight.
Overwhelmed by fresh troops, the Federals fled the battlefield in final defeat.
The faces near me were inhuman. We didn't see our foes. They were obscured in smoke and trees. One of my close comrades was smashed by a solid shot. And what reply could we make to that? Men fell writhing and others melted from sight. And we saw the glitter of bayonets coming against our flank. And we heard the order to retire. Union Major Abner R. Small.
Through a combination of determination and luck, the Confederates had won the war's first great battle. For the surviving Union soldiers, the worst was yet to come.
The Union Army fell back from Henry House Hill. It had been fighting for 7 hours. It was just exhausted. It had done all that recruits could be asked to do. And then occurred this unforeseen disaster that would haunt the Union war effort for months to come.
That retreating rabble of troops came up to the terribly frightened group of civilians who had come out to watch the great battle, come out from Washington in their Sunday best, the ladies with their parasols, the men in their linen coats and straw hats, to watch the great Union victory.
Along with all of these soldiers and the cannons and the wagons and the caissons and the ambulance trains, all of these civilians get out on that same road in their buggies and carriages, and they created the mother and daddy of all traffic jams in this country. And just at that moment, a very fortuitous Confederate artillery shell arched in on the bridge and exploded and blew up a wagon, which completely tied up the bridge.
Panic spreads very easily among men who already know that they're beaten. Seeing their escape route cut off in that fashion is all it took to put McDowell's army from a retreat into a panic as men dropped their knapsacks, dropped their guns, dropped everything else, and simply ran for their lives, swam across, and didn't stop running, in some cases, until they got all the way back to Washington.
We tried to tell them there was no danger, called on them to stop, implored them to stand. We called them cowards, put out our heavy revolvers and threatened to shoot, but all in vain. General Irvin McDowell.
Prominent civilians were taken prisoner by the rebels, including New York Congressman Alfred Ely, who was brought before Colonel E.B.C. Cash.
Cash absolutely exploded with a tremendous string of oaths, which essentially boiled down to, "You son of a bitch, you're one of the politicians who caused this war. If it weren't for people like you, there wouldn't be a war now, and I'm going to kill you." And he pulled his pistol, the colonel did, and tried to get a clear shot at Ely, who was crouching behind the sergeant so that the colonel couldn't get a clear shot at him. And there's this comic opera going on of an officer spurring his horse around and a civilian crouching behind a sergeant so that he won't be shot on the field.
Congressman Ely escaped with his life, but would spend the next several months in a Confederate prison. Meanwhile, remnants of the Union Army fled 20 miles to Washington.
One Confederate wag noted after the battle that it took the Union Army 4 days to get to Bull Run, and it took them only 12 hours to get back to Washington afterwards.
Those 12 hours were an ordeal, reeling from exhaustion. Awake for as long as 30 hours, the Federals staggered through the night.
I suffered untold horrors from thirst and fatigue, but struggled on, clinging to my gun and cartridge box. Many times I sat down in the mud, determined to go on no further, and willing to die to end my misery. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
As dawn broke on July 22nd, Union soldiers began to trickle back into the capital.
For civilians in Washington, to get the first sight of their returning soldiers and men covered with dirt, some covered with mud, not carrying their weapons, hands, heads, arms bandaged, with panic on their faces, had to be the most demoralizing sight that a national capital could encounter. When Lincoln himself saw it, he could only say to another congressman nearby, "It's bad, it's damned bad."
For a few anxious days, Washington was gripped with the fear of a Confederate attack. But the rebels were far too disorganized to press their advantage. Washington remained safe, and shame over the defeat and retreat gave way to a newfound determination to win at all costs.
One of Lincoln's first actions, just a few days after the battle, was to issue a call for 500,000 volunteers. He followed that almost immediately with a call for another 500,000 volunteers to serve for 3 years. So he has put out a call for 1 million men, which shows that he now had a much better understanding of what he was facing.
Flushed with victory, the South at first believed that the war was over, but euphoria turned to mourning as the population realized that its victorious army had suffered grievous losses.
In a few days, every local newspaper starts to publish the lists of the boys from that county or that town who went to war and went to the great battle and who are now not going to be coming home. It was the first taste the Confederate civilian population had of what the war was going to be like. They couldn't hear the guns, perhaps. They didn't see the blood on the battlefields, but in the black and white of newsprint, they could see the cost of the war that they were now engaged in.
Suddenly, the moonlighted magnolia aspect of war disappears. Now it's no longer the bands playing gaily and the flags flying beautifully. Now it's going to be a stinking war, a war that smells, a war with blood, a war with death.
Once the excitement of battle faded, these men saw something that no American had ever seen before, and indeed no American had truly expected. 900 dead, 3,000 wounded, scattered across these fields. Strategically, both sides went back to where they had been. Didn't amount to much. But emotionally, it was a signal that this war would be different. It would be fought on a higher, infinitely more awesome and destructive level.
I cannot give you an idea of the terrors of this battle. For 10 long hours, it literally rained balls, shells, and other missiles of destruction. The sight of the dead, the cries of the wounded, the thundering noise of battle can never be put on paper. The dead, the dying, and the wounded all mixed up together, friend and foe embraced in death, some crying for water, some praying their last prayer, some trying to whisper to a friend their last farewell message to the loved ones at home. It is heart-rending. I cannot go on any further. Mine eyes are damp with tears. Jesse Reed, 8th South Carolina.